We're talking property prices now here on the Business Breakfast. News out this morning, a new index out, the ValuStrat Price Index, looking at what's happening in home sales transactions. Declan King is Managing Director and Group Head of Real Estate at ValuStrat, the people who put these numbers together. Declan, good morning. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning, Brandy.
Do you want to remind us what the ValuStrat Price Index actually measures?
Well, it's a monthly index, and as a firm of valuers, we ask ourselves every month how much a basket of typical properties across Dubai change in value.
Right, so you're not just looking at one property, you're looking at an amalgamation of properties.
It's quite an in-depth mix of both apartments and villas that broadly represent the entire Dubai freehold residential market.
Well, that index for this month has come in fairly steady. It's just over 65 points to 65.4 points. Do you want to put that in context for us?
The important context this month, Brandy, is that for the first time in 3 years, it's actually shown that the lowest monthly drop. So the monthly drop between October and November was only 0.2%. So if we take all of the properties that we value across that index and we blend the drop in value, it was only 0.2%, which is the lowest rate of decline in 3 years. And most interestingly, it did show that some villa values are now beginning to rise or stand still, which is an interesting statistic in itself.
So what does that actually say about where we are with prices at the moment? Every real estate agent would quite gladly tell me that we've reached the bottom and are on the way up. What do you think?
So we're not brokers, but we do talk to brokers every day as we value real estate for banks and corporates around the city. And when we've been talking to brokers over the last few months, they've been giving us this anecdotal opinion that they've seen increased demand, particularly for villas, that they've seen some prices recover. And it now seems that we may be seeing that wash through to values.
Right, because we've been told the same thing, and I have to say we're taking it with a, not so much a pinch, but a cellar of salt, Declan.
What we're seeing and what we're being told, and we do have to respect what brokers tell us because they are at the coal face. And it seems to be that with the mixture of COVID and people moving to wanting more personal space, both internally within their accommodation and with garden space, that there has been a move towards people wanting villas over apartments. With historically low interest rates, with mortgage repayments being less than the equivalent rental repayment on some properties, and with low supply. So we are seeing the impact of the real estate committee, Brandy, where we're now getting less new home supply across the city of Dubai. But that has created some demand points where supply just isn't meeting demand, specifically in some sought-after villa communities, and that's putting that slight upward push on price. Would emphasize that it's slight, it's really just a technical rise. It does speak to some of the anecdotal evidence that agents have said. Yes, agents may talk the market up for obvious reasons, but we are now, as valuers, beginning to see that the reality of those deals being done perhaps wash through to some increase in valuations.
Well, let's put this in a bit more of a historical context, though, because you don't just look at the monthly change, which would suggest that stabilisation. You look at the annual change, and we're still down nearly 14%.
Correct. So we've been measuring these values since 2014. So it's one of the oldest and longest indexes in the city of Dubai. And it's been falling since then. And year on year, on average, if you bought a house a year ago or an apartment a year ago in Dubai, it's worth 14 or 15% less than it was a year ago. And obviously that is bad news. And we do broadly expect that downward total VPI index number to continue to decline. And it will need to see if these upticks in some villa values, if that happens again in December and again in January. So I think the broad thing that we would say is the property market is still in decline with some small upticks specifically for sought-after villa communities. Let's see how that opens in the new year.
Yeah, I mean, what are you expecting? You've got numbers, obviously, to put together at the end of the year going into January, but 2020 as a whole, if you were describing it to someone coming into the UAE real estate market, the Dubai real estate market for the first time, what would you say?
I would say if you buy an apartment, it's possibly going to be worth less at the end of next year than it is at the beginning of the year, with some very few exceptions of prime, premium apartments in well sought-after locations. If you're buying villas, perhaps the market is beginning to turn, particularly in those sought-after Emirates Living, Arabian Ranches, Dubai Hills, JVC, JVT, Meadows, Lakes, Jumeirah Islands, those types of locations. Perhaps now may be the time to tell. Obviously, as valuers, we're not giving people buy advice. But we may be witnessing a slight turn. But again, that health warning that it's too early to say the market is turning, this may just be the first early signs that we're seeing in some sectors.
Just to ask you very quickly before we let you go about supply, which you mentioned earlier, one of our big stories this morning, comments from the Emaar Properties chairman, Mohammed Alabar, saying that they are temporarily halting new property projects. How much of a big deal is that?
Well, I think Mr. Alabar's comments are based on them turning off the tap over the last year or so, and that would make sense, again, looking at the Real Estate Committee, and that's what it was designed to do. And that would speak to the lack of sales demand, particularly for apartments in some locations. But I think it would be interesting to see if developers start to move back into those sectors of the market where we are now beginning to see some demand. I think it would be likely that, again, that would be in the villa segment.
Declan King, Managing Director and Group Head of Real Estate at ValuStrat, talking us through those numbers that have come out this morning on the Dubai property market and the average value, seeing a bit of stabilisation, it would appear, this month for the first time in a wee while.